Hello, it's Helen, and welcome back to the channel, or welcome for the first time if you're new. Today, as you can probably see, I'm making brownies, but the real purpose of this video is to talk about my new obsession, the Midnight Gospel. If you haven't seen the Midnight Gospel, I will give a brief summary. The main character, named Clancy, is sort of a deadbeat, and he basically buys this simulator machine to go into simulated universes that are about to experience their own apocalypse and interviews them for his podcast. So the entire show basically follows him interviewing various people from various different universes for his podcast. The podcast is a big part of the show, but the thing that I like about it is that it doesn't feel like you're listening to a podcast. I think it's really easy to get bored when you're just listening to people talk for 2 hours, but for one, these episodes are like traditional cartoon length. They're not actually that long. And on top of that, there's so much going on that you really don't have time to get bored, because by the time that you might, this episode is already over. The podcast and the show is actually basically a compilation of clips from an actual podcast that the voice actor for Clancy hosts, which is probably why it comes off like a real podcast and not like a written podcast, if that makes any sense. Even though the show is scripted, everything comes off really naturally. So it seems like they're having a normal conversation within the plot of the world and within the things that are going on, but it actually has a lot to do with real podcasts that have happened that had nothing to do with like the plot of the show. I think the biggest thing I like about it is they really cover a wide range of topics. And the reason why I think it's the future of podcasts is that the Midnight Gospel proves that you can translate almost any genre of podcast into this animated format. I was extremely impressed with how well they did that, because I can't imagine how difficult that must have been trying to tie a normal podcast into the plot of a show. For example, the first show has to do with good drugs versus bad drugs and things like that, and there's a conversation around what should and shouldn't be allowed and how people abuse things, and it's a whole big conversation. Not a debate though, which I also really liked. They found a way to make something that could be a debate for a lot of people and make it into a conversation. I think that's why it's hard for people to cover some of those controversial issues like the ones in the show, because it's hard not to get heated and start a debate out of it. The show actually does this really well though, and it never feels like an argument, but to me it never feels like it's preachy either. They have many people from many different backgrounds talking about their own experiences, and a lot of the topics covered in the podcast are very philosophical. So they talk about things like death and how you should live leading up to your death, and why obsessing about the future is just ruining your present, and how to be present. And it talks about these different factors of things that I think, especially now in the state that the world is in, are really important, that a lot of people aren't necessarily getting or hearing about or talking about, but that are really important. All of the plots of the episodes, even though they are not directly like what the podcast is talking about, like, they're kind of having their own adventure and then having this side conversation the entire time, but the side conversation relates to what they're talking about. So I'll give you an example. There's one episode where the characters are essentially being marched to their death, and Clancy asks, are you kind of scared right now? Because I think we're about to die. And she talks about how she has been kind of surrounded by death her entire life, and that because of that, she doesn't really feel that fear as much anymore, because to her, she's just been around it. But it's within the plot of the show, so they're like about to die, and so they start having a conversation about death. And the even more interesting thing I think about the stories is that even though it's a fake podcast, right, it's based on a real podcast and real things have happened to the people that are voice acting it. One familiar face on the show, at least for me, was, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Her first name is Caitlin, and you might recognize her if you've seen her series on YouTube. It's called Ask a Mortician, and she basically did an episode about funeral practices and why you shouldn't be afraid of, you know, dead bodies and things like that, even though you've been led to believe they're like diseased, or, you know, the embalming is necessary and they have to do all this other stuff before you can see them, and like this and that, and why a lot of that is just kind of misconceptions, and how doing that and overcoming that fear can actually help you cope with your own grief a lot. And so I think it's really interesting how they work educational and kind of philosophical concepts together as well. I realize not everyone is into deep philosophical conversations all the time, and I get that, but it doesn't feel weighty. I think part of what is difficult about some content like that is that it can make you feel this sense of like existential dread, like you're living your life entirely wrong, and you're trying to learn about this new philosophy that's just proving everything is wrong. You need to start changing everything, and for me at least, that can make me feel anxious, and just learning some of that information can feel very overwhelming at times. But I think this show, the fact that it's animated and the fact that it's very lighthearted, and there are a lot of, you know, jokes thrown in. It's not serious like you would think, because they're talking about really serious topics, but there's a lot of joking around and there's a lot of banter back and forth, and it feels like I said, a natural conversation between friends. And so I think that really contributes to how calming the show is, and to me it is very calming. I've been really stressed out recently, and watching that was just kind of a reprieve almost, because the way it talks about life, there are so many layers that you can dive into if you really want to. You know, you can sit down and watch it and just take it for what it is, or you can really think about it and try and take things from it, because there are so many lessons that you could learn from it. And even on top of that, there are overarching themes as well majorly about birth and death throughout every single episode pretty much. And you can kind of see this cycle of how everything is essentially cyclical in the world. And it's very interesting. And the big reason I think it's important for future podcasts to start implementing things like this is because the Midnight Gospel really shows the potential for education through interesting means. It talks about huge topics that most people don't necessarily want to get into in a normal environment, you know? Most people watch TV and shows to get away from the world and to not have to think. And this show definitely makes you want to think, but not in a way that you have to be previously prepared for. I did not know at all what the Midnight Gospel was going into it. I didn't know what it was about. I had no idea about it, so I started watching it and went in cold. So I was not prepared whatsoever for the content that was in it, but I was so pleasantly surprised. The biggest thing is that while you're learning and while you're paying attention to the plot, but also paying attention to the conversations between characters, you're learning unintentionally, and forming your own opinions about what they're talking about. And you don't, obviously, like I said, with many different worldviews being included, you might not agree with every single one, but every episode includes fundamental truths that everyone can understand. For me, there was an episode about magic, and I don't really know anything about people who practice magic like in the real world, but something that I thought was really interesting was they talked about basically the law of attraction and how that's a big part of magic, and how being positive and focusing on positive things leads you towards positive things, but focusing on primarily negative things is going to most likely lead you down a negative path. And I think that it's a pretty universal truth, and in many different belief systems there are elements of that where ultimately the goal is to focus on where you want to go rather than what you don't want. And it's things like that and messages that everyone can apply to their life in some way that I think really makes the Midnight Gospel so interesting. I've never heard of another show like this, although it's certainly possible that there are some, but this is definitely the first show that I've seen where I felt like I left every episode more educated than I went in, but it didn't feel at all like educational content. I think overall the best thing about it is that it really is able to draw you in a way that I've not seen many shows be able to do, and explain complex topics in a way that anyone can understand without being boring. I think it's especially good content for young people because these are the types of things that are good to learn early on. You know, they're lessons about how to cope with life, essentially. And it's not telling you that you have to believe a certain way or think a certain way in order to be happy or to be successful, but just that things like, you know, letting go and forgiving other people can be very freeing for you, and that trying to live in the present instead of trying to constantly control your life and plan for every little detail in the future that you have no idea is going to happen, how just letting those things go and being where you are instead of worrying about everything else can be very cathartic and can give you a sense of clarity in a difficult situation. And I think that's something that we all need right now, is some clarity and some comfort in a time where there's so much confusion and so much angst. I feel like I just finished stirring this, so I'm gonna put it in a pan and we will talk more while the brownies cook. I think in this day and age, it's really easy to get caught up in your own situation and your own feelings and kind of get in your head too much, especially when you're not seeing other people. I think it can be really difficult to kind of get out of your own mind and look at the situation objectively. And I think that's what a lot of this show encourages, that is really helpful, which is that there are so many universal experiences that we can feel so alone in, but that everyone experiences, or that most people experience within their lifetime, that if we choose to speak with others about those things and try and open up, that a lot of the time we can bond over that and we can feel less alone. As well as how a lot of times our experience in a particular situation is based on our perspective rather than how bad it is. I think practicing things like mindfulness and looking to deepen your understanding of the world and the ultimate things that are important in life help you to be less worried about what's going on in your particular situation. It's not easy, and the show doesn't pretend that it is. I think so many other podcasts could benefit from that as well, because it keeps you engaged a lot more easily than a traditional podcast format. And it sucks because obviously it takes a lot longer to develop a plot and animate something along with it. But I think that in the future, in order to help educate people on certain issues, the best way to do that may just be through an animated podcast. Maybe that's kind of a bold claim to make, but I can see a taste of what that could be like. I think often the best way to educate people is by doing it when they're not expecting to learn something. I think the first episode is a really good example of this because, like I was saying earlier, it focuses a lot on drugs and good drugs and bad drugs, and something that's very highly controversial within America and doesn't really seem to have a clear solution that clears up every problem on both sides. This episode, though, does a pretty good job of covering the biggest and most valid concerns on both sides of the argument, while also throwing in some, anecdotal stories and things like that. And it does kind of go back and forth and helps you understand both sides of the argument, but at the end of the day, it does kind of come to a particular conclusion. And I think all of the episodes do that. Some are less controversial, I would say, than others. Some just cover certain philosophies about the world and things like that. But I think regardless of what episode you choose, there's going to be something to pull out of it that could possibly help you. Something that you get in the show that you don't necessarily get as much in a podcast, I think, is you can see that the main character has a lot of very relatable flaws. Even though he is learning all these things in this podcast, you can tell in a lot of ways he's still running from his problems and doesn't want to take responsibility for his actions and just keeps trying to find a solution other than what he knows needs to be done. And I like that aspect a lot because I think something that is missing from podcasts can be that personal element. Even if someone's telling stories about their life, it's difficult to see how that has actually impacted them. And so I think being able to see a character react to the different things that are going on, but also actively change because of the things that people are telling him, helps instill more of a desire to change in the viewer. It's easy to hear these vague platitudes about how you should live your life and things like that, but seeing someone actively trying to live them out and also having struggles with that, and just because they've heard this thing and know this thing doesn't mean that they automatically feel great and all of their problems are solved. It's a process, and I think the character of Clancy shows that really well because he's very dynamic. He's very much a work in progress throughout the show, and even by the end, it's not like, oh, happy ending, he's all better now and everything is great. Like, there is sort of a happy ending. It has a weird ending, but it's not this, oh, he's a great person now and he's over all of his issues and now everything's wonderful, you know? And I think that's something that a lot of shows try to do, or a lot of podcasts try to do, saying, well, this was really hard for me, but I got over it and now I'm great and I'm enlightened and I feel wonderful all the time. But the Midnight Gospel doesn't try and do that. It doesn't try and spin things so that, well, since you know this now, you'll feel great. And if you practice this thing, you'll feel great. Or if you believe this thing, you'll feel great. It shows that there's not a single quick fix to how you feel or your problems or how difficult life can be sometimes, because there's not, you know, just the simple, oh, here it is, and now I feel great all the time. And I think a lot of the problem with a lot of ways that people present philosophies about the world and philosophies about life is that they do kind of take that structure of, you know, for example, if I really believed very strongly in meditation and I said, you know, meditation is the only way for you to feel better. That's the only way you'll ever feel calm. That's the only way you'll ever feel, you know, connected to your own body and to the people around you. That's the only possible way. And so you try meditating and you don't feel different and you think, wow, I must be broken, or it must be impossible for me to feel happiness because this isn't working for me. And I think we can tend to feel that way about a lot of different philosophies and think, you know, people tell us, well, just do this thing and it'll work, you'll feel better. But we don't always feel better. And so throughout the show, they're kind of building this toolkit, and it's shown in every time Clancy goes to a new universe, he brings back a new pair of shoes and puts them on this shelf. And it's basically a metaphor of building this toolkit of knowledge and things and learning more things about the world that help you figure out how to deal with different situations and how to keep going despite how much you may not like a particular situation. There are so many things and so many aspects of hardship that different people can go through. That's why it's hard to just hear someone say, well, this is how you should deal with it, because in your individual situation that may not be the case, or you may need something else. And a lot of the people in these podcasts talk about very human issues of, you know, people suggesting things to them and why those things may be true but don't feel comforting in that moment. And I think building up all of those things and all those techniques for learning how to deal with situations is important, because, you know, it's not about getting out of the hardship, it's about learning how to feel okay while that's going on, and to not suppress our feelings, but learning how to accept those things and continue moving forward and try to feel happy despite everything in our life not being happy. There are so many things that I could talk about with this show, but I definitely think if you're looking for a show to watch, especially if you are anxious or stressed about the current situation, or you just want something fun to watch that's kind of short that, you know, you might learn a thing or two, I would definitely recommend The Midnight Gospel. I'm not sure if any of this made sense. I guess I'll see in editing. But I'd like to do some more of these videos in the future if possible and kind of talk about things I'm interested in. Stick around if you're interested for more of that. I don't know what that will entail, but hopefully something interesting, hopefully something that interests you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will show you the brownies, actually. Also, I technically used a recipe from TikTok, so maybe I'll just mess around and put it in the description in case you would like it. But hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you decide to come back for the next one. Subscribe, maybe, who knows? I may be crazy, but it could happen. Who knows? happens to the best of us. Anywho, thank you for joining me for this weird journey into my interests, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.